Okay. Hi, everyone. It's a huge pleasure for me to introduce Resson, Kantai, Duff. And my name is Domenico Dentoni, as you can read here. I am professor at Montpellier Business School. And I'm going to run this quick interview as a sort of appetizer, I would say, of the cross-sector social interactions conference that will take place in April, organized by the University of Cape Town Graduate School of Business. And it's going to be the 11th time that the conference is organized over a range of 18 years, in fact. And the theme of this year will be Power and Inclusion in Cross-Sector Social Interactions. I've had the huge pleasure of meeting Resson last week, in fact, thanks to one of the co-organizers, the wonderful Sarita Segal, that introduced us. And Resson, as she will tell us in a few minutes, as far as I remember, grew up in rural Kenya. At the moment, she plays the role of portfolio funding directors at Maliasili, and has a background and lots of wisdom built in the area of biodiversity and conservation. So I will pause it here for the moment. I would like Resson to introduce yourself, and perhaps as to start this this appetizer to the conference, where you will speak more extensively with the participants. I would like to ask you a little bit about your background, how you built wisdom in this area, and what made you what you are today.
Thank you so much, Domenico. Well, how did I get here? I don't quite know what is the correct way to start that. But perhaps I start by saying I am an urban Kenyan, and I went to school to the University of Nairobi, where I studied zoology. And I studied zoology in I'd say, a post-colonial setting with very neo-colonial ideas of how conservation works in reality. And one of the ideas that came up very strongly as we were learning all of these very deep scientific concepts about the animals that we were to quote unquote protect in the wild, was to teach communities how to live with wildlife. And that really struck me, and it didn't strike me at the time. I just thought that was how we do it as the elites in the conservation space, as it were. But when I began to actually work in conservation, a decade and a half and probably more ago, I realized that that was quite the opposite, and it was quite not what should be happening. And in fact, it harkens to something that I've heard Rajesh, who's also going to be giving one of these teasers, talk about the epistemicide, the idea of the death of local knowledges because we are elevating the educated among us. And so when that really struck me, I began to really be interested in transforming the profile of a conservationist, to include and to really elevate ordinary, indigenous, and local women and children and men, and the young, the old. All of these people who are involved in conservation should really be at the center of it and should be known as the center of it. And that journey took me on it all took me on a journey to change the power dynamics to support community-led conservation across Africa, which is now the job that I have at Maliasili as the portfolio funding director, where I'm amplifying both the voices of all these local leaders who are running local conservation organizations across 12 different countries, doing very site-specific work to connect up landscapes, to restore these landscapes and the species that live in them. And also to, the other part of my job is also to change these funding dynamics, because there is a very big need to change both how these local groups partner with international groups, and how they partner with how they partner with donors, and how donors see this relationship. Things really need to shift. And I think the world is now waking up to how we build collective action around this work.
It's super interesting, Resson. What makes me think, as you describe your experience, your current position, is this interplay that we should always keep in mind between ecological systems, which of course are the core of conservationism, for example, and taking care of biodiversity, with the knowledge systems we are entrenched in, the funding systems, and the other structures of power that are around us. And it seems that from a systems thinking perspective, they usually take you're connecting many of these dots throughout your lived experience. I was curious, perhaps, if you could elaborate on in the past few years how your experience translated or was embodied in the vision that you are building. So one word that I've learned this week is Naivasha. I know that last year you developed a Naivasha vision together with many partners, both in Africa and beyond. So could you describe how that fits in, and how that could be an example for many of us of partnering and partnerships that take care of that understand the power and inclusion?
Yes, the Naivasha vision and the whole African Community Conservation Forum, which we held as Maliasili with several partners and as a whole group, bringing together African conservation leaders alongside donors, international, people from international organizations, some large, some small, and just really trying to work out the issues around power and partnership. And the whole Naivasha vision, which was born out of this event, the event itself was born out of a need to start speaking about power in conservation, because power is a huge, very emotive topic, but it is very often not spoken about openly. In Kenya, what we say is, we talk about it nyuma ya tent, behind the tent, under the table, very quietly, and yet it is something that really weaves a story and really can bind or could actually unlock a lot of things if it is done well. What we have in conservation is very strong colonial histories of people coming to tell people how to live with wildlife, how to do various things with in the landscapes that we have, and yet we have such incredible, diverse, indigenous and local communities and local organizations that are working at the point of impact, that the world is waking up to and realizing that we must support these organizations. But how do you do it when there are these power dynamics that we often don't talk about? And how do you partner in ways that are actually beneficial and add value? And so we put on this event and we said, we must have these discussions around power in partnership. But what we realized is that the first thing we had to do was break down power in person. So before we get to how we're partnering up, we also have to look at ourselves and how we ourselves wield power and use power and think about power. And we look at local organizations, and very often their leaders, when they are faced with donors or international organizations, they often feel powerless. And donors will then feel rather defensive about these power relations. And then the discussion will stop there. There is silence on one side, maybe some defensiveness on another side. And what we realize is that every single person who was at that event has power and has agency and can actually start to look at that in their own ways, and maybe also start to look at the ways that they feel both powerful and powerless. And once we had that day, and we designed the day very specifically to make sure people started to feel like people, as opposed to like cogs in a machine, or like things that didn't have access or had too much access to this power thing that we were talking about. And so at the end of that day, we had donors who did not feel like dollar signs for the first time. We had local actors who started to feel like, oh, I actually have agency, and together we can build a bigger conversation around these things. And so when we started to talk about power in partnership and looking at both partnership and funding issues, people were able to be a lot more vulnerable and able to really start speaking about what they needed, what they had seen, what some of the challenges were, and what some of the opportunities were that could be unlocked in the system. And that really helped. It really, I mean, even just simple things that we did, such as, making sure people sat on picnic blankets and, you're all together sitting on the ground together. That there are no reserved seats in any particular session. Those were just little things that we did within that to help build a broader movement around collective action to correct some of these power dynamics. And what then came out at the end of it was a shared vision, the Naivasha vision. The meeting was held in Naivasha in north of Nairobi in Kenya. And some of the key things that came out were, for the first time I have seen in writing, people coming together to say communities are key actors in conservation. They are investors. They are not just beneficiaries for things to come to them. That people have to prioritize the rights of local people, that people then have to start to invest time in building these partnerships instead of just working on a transactional basis. And this tied to a couple of the reports that Maliasili and some of our partners had done previously, which included the Greening the Grassroots report, which was around reducing these barriers and finding more opportunities for funding, for better funding to flow to local actors, and Rooting for Change, which was around building stronger partnerships and strengthening these partnerships between local and global actors. So that vision, I think, has a broader message, not just for the people who are in the room and not just for conservationists, but for academics and other practitioners in this field.
This is super interesting, Resson. In fact, there is from my experience as a scholar on multi-stakeholder partnerships, first of all, so there's a whole area that has been developed around studying practices of interaction between people. So, I mean, the way you describe how coming together, for example, sharing meals, being on the same ground, not having reserved spots, really creating a collective vibe where everybody feels equal in that space, and reducing power dynamics and reducing and acknowledging power dynamics is particularly important. There is many experiences of cross-sector partnerships around the world where, in fact, time, for example, has not been considered in the time of people to travel to these meetings, what it means also to dedicate time to their daily activities, as they take care of the land and other aspects. So this comes together in very interesting ways. And this Naivasha vision is definitely, as I mentioned to you, one of those documents and living documents, the way I understood it, that we can carry on as academics, as example of building partnerships, on a common ground. I would like to conclude this appetizer with a question which is open, of course, both to you and to all participants that will attend the conference later on, about what can we do, or what else can we do as academics, in your view, to contribute to partnering in ways that is aware of power and inclusion dynamics in conservation, but perhaps more broadly. Our audience is also ranges of interest also on other topics than conservation. So what would be the suggestion for academics that work on this space?
I think you are like a lot better place to answer this question from an academic perspective, but from kind of the practitioner's world. I think that we often find that academics do so much to improve and to add to the bodies of knowledge that help us to understand our world and our worldviews better. But when it comes to the practical ways that are needed, I think the academic world could do a lot more to ensure that they are not holding the view that they hold all the knowledge. There is this kind of, yes, there is local knowledge, there is indigenous knowledge, it is important. There are these local actors who are doing this work, but very often when it comes to how the partnerships work, they then end up being a bit more transactional and a bit more like, we set the agenda elsewhere, and then we come and share with these local people what we are thinking. And I think the idea of how to co-create, or how to spend time, invest time in co-creating agendas and really investing time in partnerships, also, you know, helping these local actors to hold international organizations, donors, and the academic world to account as we build these partnerships, I think is going to be very critical, because we know that, you know, even if we're just looking at indigenous people as a group, they are, you know, maybe they hold about 85% of the co-managed very important biodiversity areas in the world, and yet they're only about 5% of the population. So how academics, practitioners, all these organizations, whether local or international, can come together to support them and to make sure that we are always in our work holding those power dynamics as a major thought point as we think through the thought process, as we think through how to partner with these local groups. But yes, I would love to hear from you what you think should be done.
It's fascinating. I mean, what I'm hearing from you, and I agree, is you know, like finding ways of building coherence between our discourses, our strategies, and our everyday actions. That often, you know, yeah, our discourses go in the direction of, you know, bottom up, you know, putting communities at the center and so on. But then I was putting also our strategies and our everyday action is like where I see a lot of inconsistencies often in you know, in how people do things. So this is fascinating, and I think is an area where we should continue our conversation soon in Cape Town. So I think we can close here our appetizer, and is an invitation, of course, for us and for all of you watching this video to please join us in a conversation in Cape Town pretty soon. So I would say goodbye, Resson, and goodbye to all our audience, and see you soon at the conference. Don't forget to register, of course. Bye-bye.